In 1877, something remarkable happened in the United States, something never before seen in the young nation. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It was the first general strike held in the U.S. Workers around the country had decided that they had had it, with the corporate state now in full control of the Republic since the end of the Civil War, and decided to do something about it. In one particular city, the right conditions, in combination with a large immigrant working class with a history of radical politics, gave rise to another phenomenon never seen before or since on U.S. soil, a revolutionary commune. That's right, a communist party and the working class holding full control, if only for a short while, over one of the largest cities in the nation. This is the amazing story of the St. Louis Commune. The revolutions of 1848 across Europe set the stage for the class struggle to come for decades around the world. Marx and Engels had told of a specter haunting Europe, and while these revolutions ultimately did not bring about the communist revolution, they did create a mass movement of class-conscious workers, many who found their way to the U.S. Many veterans of the German Revolution settled in St. Louis, and the ideas they had picked up from the radical revolutionary movements in Europe came with them. Many had fought for the Union in the Civil War, as they correctly identified the struggle against slavery as a progressive struggle for the emancipation of all workers. After the triumph of the Union over the Confederacy, the budding steel, coal, rail corporations began the full conquest of the American nation. The workers that had volunteered to fight for the Union now found themselves as the enemy of the corporate state after having fought to preserve the Union. The consolidation of power and control over the nation by corporate interests resulted in the U.S. beginning the inevitable march towards achieving full industrialization and monopoly capitalism. The resulting conditions of the workers in this process was the stagnation of wages, increase in already long hours, the suppression of dissent by their bosses. In addition, the Panic of 1873 led to many railroads laying off workers. The labor movement responded to these deteriorating conditions with small, decentralized strikes, tending to be rural and isolated in the monstrous conditions that were company towns. Despite overwhelming support by the masses, leadership of these labor movements was still limited to local leadership. The local nature of the class struggle meant that the railroad companies were relying on local militias to enforce their rule. This was problematic for the railroad, as these militias were made up of local working people who were generally hostile to the railroad companies and sympathetic to their fellow workers. This led to the further use of federal troops and large private security firms to break strikes and enforce the rule of capital. These conditions laid out the stage that was to become the 1877 Great Railroad Strike, the first general strike in American history. These conditions laid out the stage that was to become the 1877 Great Railroad Strike. The origin of the strike began in Martinsburg, West Virginia, at the Baltimore and Ohio, that's B&O, Railroad Station in July 16, 1877. After yet another 10% wage cut. The strike quickly spread to other states, especially large cities around the nation. The workers' demands included the 8-hour workday, end of child labor, and wage increases and guarantees. The political ruling class was unprepared to handle a myriad of strikes occurring in waves, making it necessary for the locals to request federal troops to break these strikes. This brings us to St. Louis, where a unique blend of these events happening in the broader world converged in what would become the first and only seizure, however brief, of an American city by the working class. The Working Men's Party of the United States was the first Marxist political party in the U.S., formed chiefly by immigrants from German states. Working alongside Lassallean organizers, they established the first communist political program here. Owing as a compromise between the Marxist and Lassallean factions, the Worker Party USA agreed to participate in electoralism only where it deemed that the party had enough influence to exercise a perceptible influence on the outcomes. The stated goals of the WPUSA included the establishment of trade unions on a national and international basis to ameliorate the conditions of the working people. Building off of the popular demands of the workers at the time, in a utilization of early mass line, the WPUSA demanded 8-hour workdays, sanitary inspection for working and housing conditions, abolition of prison labor, end of child labor under 14 years old, free educational institutions, employer liability for workplace accidents, abolition of conspiracy laws, nationalization of all transport companies, and equal rights for women in the workplace. If all of that sounds familiar, it's because while, yes, concessions have been made and won, they are always under subject of repeal while the capitalist class has a large influence over the corporate state. While the party never truly took up an official stance on the issues of black workers, they did have black membership amongst the party. The official stance was that white and black workers had the same common enemy, the capitalists. At the time, it was incorrectly thought that racism would sort itself out after the revolution, that issues of race would be solved by socialism. Here we do see some of the early failings of communist programs in the U.S., the national question and combating of chauvinism amongst the majority white workers would come later from communist organizations and very much owed to the experiences and teachings of Lenin and Stalin. Now we come to the Commune itself. After an outbreak of strikes among various different workers on July 21st, 1877 in East St. Louis, the railroad workers declared their support for the strikes, forming an executive committee that issued General Order No. 1 to stop all freight traffic in East St. Louis from the western part of St. Louis, but to allow passenger and mail trains to go forward as to avoid public inconvenience and to avoid giving the federal government pretext to act on behalf of the general public. A huge gathering of workers on the east side convened and was joined by workers from St. Louis who ferried across the Mississippi River singing the Marseillaise, the French Revolution's theme. Among the speakers at this gathering were cries that war was being waged between capital and labor. As a general strike was officially called, the WPUSA put its effort and support behind the action. The mayor of East St. Louis, John Bowman, was a veteran of revolutions of 1848 himself and broadly supported the workers and appointed many as deputies to preserve order and protect both the workers, public, and the railroad property. Bowman was trusted by the workers to act as an intermediary between themselves and the owners and managers of the railroad. By this time, the strike had spread across East St. Louis, and the workers broadly held control. Meanwhile, across the Mississippi in St. Louis, Missouri Pacific Railroad employees were asked by their East Side comrades to join the strike, and they agreed. Though this inadvertently created an all-or-nothing scenario for the railroads. Prior to this action, the Missouri Pacific had not been one of the companies where the workers were under strike. This move ensured that the strikers would continue to strike even against railroads that had previously agreed to wage increases and so on. This, by accidental design, united the railroad companies against the general strikers. There was no incentive for a railroad to reach agreements with the workers unless they all did so. Though there had been little to no violence, H.W. Wilson, the receiver for St. Louis and Southeastern railroads, telegraphed the federal government asking if there were federal troops at hand because the situation was alarming. Wilson made it clear that his desire to confront the workers, uniting the federal, state, municipal governments, and railroad companies against the workers. In his words, the fight ought just as well be made now as any time. The strikes had been spreading across the country, and in St. Louis, the workers were engaging in meetings and committees going over what was to be done. though the supposed violence that Wilson was fearful over had never materialized despite the railroad's pleas and receiving of federal troops at the ready. Even the papers recognized that the most violent doctrines of communism are proclaimed, but no harm seems to be done by them. The federal troops' presence was clearly meant to intimidate and break the strike. At a meeting in the St. Louis Lucas Market, the workers made their demands known: $100 million on public works to create jobs, general strikes until 8-hour days, and the end of child labor. By this time, all freight traffic had been halted to and from the city aside from passenger and mail. Workers marched through Carondelet, waving red flags and shouting "Hooray for the Commune." Here, though, we saw one of the unfortunate missteps all too common with the labor movements in the U.S. The WPUSA sent a group to stop a steamboat leaving for New Orleans, reflecting the party's support for black workers. The black workers of the steamboat joined into the strike and demanded black boatmen's wages be increased by 50%. Here, though, the racial contradictions reared their ugly head again when some organizers and politicians demanded that the working class whites not unite with the working class blacks. This early example shows that while black workers were overwhelmingly eager to unite with their white comrades, the stain of slavery and colonialism was still deeply imprinted upon the consciousness of the white workers, who were not always so eager to reciprocate. The strike had now spread to businesses beyond the railroads. Vendors of all types, gasworks, factories around the city were shuttered, and the workers joined the strikes. Workers at the Union Stove Works were summarily fired, and the remaining workers commanded to man cannons and take up arms by their employer. The striking workers marched ever on, carrying more red flags of revolution throughout the city. As the municipal politicians and business owners met to create a militia to confront the workers, they were interrupted by the WPUSA and dispersed. The red flags were flying. 10,000 gathered to demand the workers elect public officials of their own class, not lawyers or the rich. Despite racial contradictions present, white and black workers marched side by side. Women and men were in the streets in solidarity. The railroad companies were claiming that they could not operate without loss if demands were met. The WPUSA countered that if the companies could not operate profitably, that the government needed to seize the property and operate the industry for the benefit of the public. All around the nation, the wealthy were scared out of their wits that the socialists were going to overthrow their legitimate government. The wealthy feared the entire system was collapsing. While across the country there was much violence, strikers and federal troops exchanging gunfire, Gatling guns deployed in Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore, St. Louis had, largely thanks to the committee and WPUSA's leadership, remained orderly and peaceful. Despite the peaceful nature of the actions of the WPUSA committee and the workers in general, more federal troops arrived. 2 companies, in fact. Despite the rumors that the strikers planned to seize the local armory and perform a coup d'etat, the committee never engaged in such action or plan. What arms the workers had were what they had purchased or had already owned. Large-scale seizure of arms had not been undertaken by the Commune. Despite no basis for federal action and the protests of General Smith and Marmaduke, the government decided to put an end to the Commune at once. Federal troops, police, and militias were marshaled to invade the WPUSA headquarters. The police were ordered to ride down the masses, and despite nobody gathered in the public that day being guilty of any crimes, the crowd was run down and dispersed all the same. Luckily, very few deaths resulted and no shots were fired. The workers and masses did not resist, and most were released immediately. The WPUSA was scattered after their building had been seized, and they immediately fell to infighting and blame towards each other over the failure of the Commune. The Irish blamed the Germans and the black workers. The Germans blamed the Irish and black workers. One thing inconstant was the white workers all blamed the black workers. Federal and state troops seized the East Bridge, linking West and East St. Louis, and the Commune was put to an end Saturday, July 28, 1877. So as the Commune came to an end, we have to take the lessons of history to heart. Despite the most nonviolent of intentions and actions of the workers, the state will always look to crush the workers and their strikes. Despite the relative nonviolence, the once radical Republican Party in their headline newspapers declared the communists were responsible for all the problems of these days, conveniently overlooking the conditions that created and led to these strikes and the Commune. The workers have much to learn from the experiences of the Commune regarding solidarity along gender and racial lines, as well as the reality of how corporations and the state will react to any threats to their rule. Seizing that armory may not have won the day in the end, but as we have been shown in revolutionary examples since, as a wise man once said, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun.